the question that Gary had, I'll post it when I get it, is that with your attitude towards the establishment, how is it that you would refer people to the establishment, in order to get, and because we have in the group another way of approaching the inner state of the rebel, and we tend to consider that being depressed, anxious, and post-traumatic stress disorder prone is a normal state of mind in the world we live in. So we usually don't advocate that people go to therapy because it makes them just adjust to a sick system. So that's what we wanted to, Gary wanted to bring that up. And wait a second now, and contact. Yeah, and have you any contacts with people who would be interested to discuss maybe in the future these sort of approaches to our spiritual and mental inner state facing what we're facing? There, I've delivered Gary's message now, so I leave that up to you. We can bring that up again, and I will send you the document on the ARG. All right, thank you for listening.
Well, I'm happy to comment on that now, if you like, because the timing of that comment and observation is really incredible, because we've been talking, tweeting with some climate psychology groups over the last couple of days, and that feedback's really good. So when we actually are approached by people who are struggling, we often recommend them onto things like Michael Dowd's post-doom, no gloom platform. There's Deep Adaptation, which is continuously running events, so there's alternatives. But we did feel it necessary to put something on our website to say we don't have the capacity or expertise as just collapse. But we might look at that wording, mightn't we, Tristan, and maybe put some alternative words in there as well. But the reaction we've had from these climate psychology groups speaks to exactly what you said, and that is, you're not allowed to talk about collapse. You're not allowed to talk. You have to adopt radical hope. That's their advice. That's their aim for people who are struggling. And it's really destructive. And it's trying to bring, as you said, it's trying to hold people within the mainstream culture and mainstream mindset. And we've come up with the term doomer conversion therapy, because that's basically what they're advocating. And it is toxic. Toxic positivity was the word that Jem Bendel used in relation to some of those ideas. So thank you. That's a great point to get started on.
Jem Bendel is not, we're not a fan of Jem Bendel, even though I discovered Jem Bendel personally in 2018 when he published his paper in the summer and all that followed, and his creation of the Deep Adaptation Forum and all that. So I thought, oh, that's all good. And I started to get involved in that and followed that. And then I ended up by realizing that I was in a cult I didn't like. I mean, seriously, there was something really wrong about it, especially in the attitude to mental health, but also in this kind of, he talks now about toxic positivity, but I don't think it's totally true of most of the people on that forum. There is a kind of a, I mean, that's very personal. I think some people in the group that I work with share the same position, that we don't feel comfortable with their general attitude, and that it looks like they are not encouraging people to work deeply on their inner state. They're more or less in a very conventional approach, and there's no seeds of revolt and rebellion in there at all, and also of enlightenment and awakening, which is, I mean, at the core of what we think will be able to enable us to go through what we're going to go through. And we need to do it inside ourselves first and foremost. And I don't think that that deep adaptation and the likes are are going that way, but that's debatable.
Yeah, look, I think that's I think it's a really interesting space that deep adaptation has opened up, and I don't necessarily want to critique deep adaptation, although I'm sympathetic to other people who've had negative experiences in that space. Definitely, I would also suggest that regenerative culture in Extinction Rebellion bore some of the same hallmarks, I would suggest, as deep adaptation. And in just my experience, rather than sort of saying that this is necessarily describes the whole of Extinction Rebellion or of deep adaptation, there's a tendency to allow, well, to facilitate the ongoing grief process without reaching any kind of conclusion. Without, I don't think there is, that there is any sense of a destination or anything to be achieved. It seems to be more sort of a vampiric and attempts to mobilize psychological power over other people. So that's just an experience that I've seen. So I relate that. But yes, that's our disclosure. Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, but lots of people are doing lots of different work in this regard around the anxiety and depression and etc. that comes with fake of your collapse accepting. And yeah, of course, that's always going to be difficult and complicated emotional, psychological territory. So yeah, it's relevant. It's not something that either Kate or I are specialists in, and we'd only be adding our advices just as individuals within, who are cognizant of what's going on around us. But I don't think we can offer anything more than that. We're not we're not psychological workers in this space. We don't have any expertise. We don't have any specialized or special knowledge to help other people get through. I just would say that people have done this since time immemorial. People die. People's children die. Loved ones die. Pets die. It's been going on forever and ever. And we were born mortal into this world, and that's just the nature of the beast, is that death will come for us all. Hopefully today's not that day, and there's still stuff that you can do. And in saying that there is stuff that you can do, let's acknowledge that more people are alive today than have ever existed, because that's how many people are on the planet, and that's how fast the Great Acceleration has been. There are more people currently alive than have ever existed in the history of Homo sapiens. So there's plenty of people alive right now to do stuff, if they can if they can manage to actualize their intention. But yeah, so I mean, that's all I would add. Thanks.
Yeah, can I ask a question about that? Because last time you talked about what you call insurrection activism or something. So maybe this community help, which sort of psychological or anxiety things are a part of, maybe that could, somewhere down the line become a part of the insurrection planning or projects that you talk about.
Yeah, insurgent planning. Oh, Kate's in there. Right, there you go. I'll get out.
No, I'll start and you can finish, Tristan. So it's insurgent planning, and it's very much about grassroots community action, communities setting their own agendas and taking action to fulfill basic needs. So, and yes, I imagine that will include care for each other on all kinds of levels. Now, insurgent planning, there are examples from all over the world of communities banding together and acting for their own interests. And these tend to be in poorer communities, poorer countries, or poorer communities. So there are examples from poorer communities in the US doing this kind of work as well. But in the West, it's where many of us are, still quite comfortable and affluent, at least for a time. This seems quite abstract because we live very individualized lives. Most of us live very individualized lives, and we're used to that, and we lack certain skills in working collectively. But the reality of collapse is that we will end up in a time and a place where we will be forced into community action to meet vital needs, which will include, I imagine, those kind of mental health needs as well. So yeah, go Tristan.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, that time is now. We acknowledge that we're in collapse, that other countries are experiencing collapse now, that civilizations prior to global modern techno-industrial civilization have experienced collapse. These, of course, include pre-colonial civilizations who have experienced genocide and collapse in slavery in many forms. There's been much collapse prior to now. There is more collapse going on now, and there's more collapse to come. In this context, yeah, insurgent planning is a useful way. I was just discussing this recently with somebody about there seem to be two approaches to taking action that people sort of have in their mind. One is the Leviathan notion of taking action, which is to have to agitate politically for a global solution to be handed down from the powerful authorities at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the food chain. And we don't think that this is particularly useful because effectively they can't act. Billionaires can't act. Politicians can't act. We're all subject to the global modern techno-industrial civilization that we live in. We're not outside of it. We're not outside of nature. We're all subject to these laws and the logics of the systems that underpin the entire system that we're in. This system can only go the way that it's going, and in that regard, it can only crash into the iceberg, and the boat can only sink. It's in the nature of the beast to do that, and you can't. Its nature cannot be changed, just like all the other civilizations that have crashed before this global one. So but in the context of insurgent planning, we can take action in a more decentralized anarchist way. And rather than appealing to power or demanding that somehow power concede power and devolve power and somehow do what needs to be done. Instead, we acting outside of centralized power. We can, as individuals and as communities, we can choose to take that power onto ourselves and to act in face of collapse. Oh, and that of course includes mental health care. So when there's no psychological systems or psychiatric wards or whatever, of course communities can rise to that challenge as well in an insurgent, anarchistic way. Thanks.
Thank you, Tristan. I mean, and absolutely, because you see, when you mentioned specialists or experts, that's a term that I loathe, really, because this is exactly why we have the problems we have. So, and I have a professional background as a doctor, so I know what I'm talking about. And I think that you are right to mention that the primary place of healing and support is the community and the family. Well, what I call family would be more the tribe than the actual nuclear family. And we've gone from that. Now we're looking for outside our circle for anonymous helps, so-called psychotherapists, psychiatrists, whatever names, healers that are not involved in our local environment, in our community, in our way of living, who are blessed by the establishment and part of the healthcare industry. So yeah, absolutely. That's where we need to find our support in time of collapse and post-collapse, if anybody survives, which is another thing we can discuss too another day. Yes, we favor very much in our discussions in our group the Greek word of ataraxia, which is a word that means freedom from fear of death and the sort of peace that you can attain. It's a very classic and ancient word. It's a state. We don't like to put too much names on things, really. That is devoid of the idea of reaching a goal. It's more, it's not even an acceptance. It's a state, an inner state that we need to get to when we realize. And that's why I think that trying to block out the anxiety and the depression that comes with the realization of what we've done and where we are is counterproductive, because we need to go through this breakthrough and we need to experience that pain. And the question that whatever method, not just talking about conventional, but even alternative approaches will try to treat it. And I think we need to experience it, and it might be hard. And we are absolutely, and I am personally avert to any call for self-harm and suicide. And I think that is just the end of, that is just the place where we must not go. And that's why I'm a bit afraid of certain groups that I've heard in the collapse world, who are kind of, they're not really, they can be dangerous for people who would be that way inclined. And particularly some people I was in contact on the Deep Adaptation Forum, the psychological forum. I think that those people would be noxious and dangerous for people who, and would block them from going through this experience, this transformative experience that we need to go through when we realized the existential threat we're in. But yeah, so let's go back to insurgent planning. I love the name. I think that's a fantastic name.
Yeah, I should say we definitely didn't come up with that name. That is a term that's used in academic literature to decide by academics from the global south and the global north to describe a particular set of activities. And I'm sure many of the communities that participate in insurgent planning don't even know that term, but it's kind of the explainer that's put into academic papers. But I'm absolutely with you on that process of moving towards what we would call collapse acceptance. Yesterday, I found myself explaining to one of these climate psychology groups on Twitter that talking about collapse might lead to being paralyzed. They were saying you can't do it because it paralyzes people. But that's a process. It's not an endpoint. Like, I was explaining to a group that's supposed to be made up of professional psychologists the grief process. Like, it's just absolutely bizarre. I'm a human geographer, okay? My knowledge of psychology comes from personal experience and a bit of Google. But the idea that a group of professional psychologists who are engaged with climate and climate activism don't recognize this as a major grief process and just stop it, try to cut it off at a particular stage and cut off any conversations about it, I just find absolutely gobsmacking. And as you said, dangerous, incredibly dangerous in particular circumstances with particular people. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to add to that as well and say I view it as an act of violence. I view it as an act of psychological violence to repress with this toxic positivity, as Jem usefully described, and force people to either eschew the community, to leave the community of people who are collapse aware, if not accepting, but collapse aware, and to go elsewhere because they are bullied by people who refuse to hear that the predicament is what it is. And it's a reality. It's a denial of reality. It's a denial of people's emotions, of their emotional needs. It's fundamentally it's an act of violence. So Torstein wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can absolutely attest to that, because I was actually squeezed out, deplatformed from one of my climate communities, and now it's like it's starting to be like 8 years ago, something like that. So I can talk about it without feeling still into it. And basically, what you then have to do when you lose all your sort of accomplices or everybody you talk to every week and every day in those climate circles, you are thrown out from one day to another, and your only, or my only sort of option is to go and sit in some building and talk to a normie about how I feel, right? So there's a normie, and this was in my sort of high school hometown. So it's a small town where, the things people talk about are even smaller than in the capital, right? So you have to sit there for hours and hours and talk to somebody completely normie who drives a car and flies intercontinentally and has absolutely no clue, as I would put it. And she is then supposed to help you inside of this office building somewhere, next to the motorway. So my alternative to this is, of course, as always, the mountains and the nature. Get out there and with friends, if that's practical, or just alone, and go berry picking, hunting, fishing. And it's also the perfect way to, with your dad or your family when you're a kid, it's a perfect way to get a natural view of life and death, right? Because your fish dies when you knack it, and you may also stumble upon dead animals in the woods, right? And I think everybody who grows up in the forest or in nature has a much more natural relationship to death than we city dwellers have, because we don't even want to see a live chicken being transformed into a shop chicken, a frozen chicken or whatever. We like to think these are just, square or you know, rectangles in a frozen bit of ice in the shop. So I would suggest, for helping people who struggle mentally with the collapse, to, you know, start moving into some kind of park or nature or beach or whatever, and then try to join or build a community, you know, from that very simple walking outside and thinking and relating to things and experiencing, of course. Just don't bring, and you shouldn't just bring all your troubles with you to nature. You should also use nature as input, you know, for changing your thought streams or changing the inside in your head, because it's an inspiration as well as a place to go and breathe, right? So yeah, I would absolutely make that a big part of a future mental insurgency, or whatever you would call it. Thanks.
Thank you, Justine. I really think that's absolutely fundamental. Unfortunately, what is the percentage of the world population that's urbanized now? It's just frighteningly high if we count in Southeast Asia, India, where urbanization has become so big. I can't remember. It's just, you probably know, it's 70%. Yeah. So you got to get 70% of people out in nature. It's tough luck, like, you know. Now, to come back to what you were saying also about those dangerous toxic positivity, all sorts of other attitudes to our fate, is that we know that in difficult times, collapsing times, end of civilizations, huge plagues, there are calls from various groups and cults and religions and stuff like that that become very appealing. And we're going to see this happening more and more. We're going to see people turning to all sorts of more or less dangerous, or from my point of view, deadly cults. And we need to also be prepared for this, because I have seen, and you see, you mentioned Michael Dowd. I've listened a lot to his stuff the last few years, and I've seen how he's invited very interesting people who are a little bit in the same kind of echo chamber as he is, even though he's kind of varied, but you kind of always meet the same kind of, you know, thing. Now, Michael Dowd is a Christian with a very, very development and spiritual awareness. And I think that he's not, I'm not saying he represents any evil as such, but he represents a little bit what people will be faced with. Yeah, eco-theologian. But yeah, but are we going to advocate that people turn to an external source to awaken and liberate themselves, or are they going to turn inside themselves where they already have it? And all these cults and religions are going to be there in these times to attract people into their nets, I'm afraid. And what do you think of that?
My first instinct is to suggest that that's what's always happened and is happening. And you know, I suppose, you know, Marxist background, I view religion as the opiate of the masses. Yeah, I mean, I recognize that it has some cohesive value, some social value on some levels, in the same way that, you know, I'm quite fond of Druidism and various other sort of ways of interpreting natural phenomenon through a mythic or mystic lens. So I wouldn't discount those languages entirely. I think that that those languages are useful. Those perceptions can be useful. However, I think religion as an enterprise, distinguished from spirituality, tends to be toxic. But I'm not saying that that some people don't find some value in those systems, but I'm heavily critical of them as well. That's my contribution. Kate?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. It's not just religion or certain individuals from different religions that have the potential or will attract people. There's government and politics. I mean, fascism looks almost inevitable as people come under more and more pressure, and communities look for a strong sense of purpose and control over life, and look in the wrong directions for who the enemy is. So it's broader for me than just religious. I don't have concerns about Michael Dowd. I am not him. But yes, there are people that pop up in the climate space, or collapse space, deep ad space, that describe themselves in a way that makes you think, yeah, no, not good. So yeah. Tristan knows some of the people, or at least one of the people I'm talking about. But anyone who has tags on themselves as being in some way more spiritually enlightened or more knowing, and therefore everyone should listen to them and follow them, alarm bells. Yep.
Yeah, stay small, stay local. There's no need to think in big numbers and big organizations and all that, because we can't handle that. So your approach with decentralization and encouraging communities is the only way where we can do it at our scale, what we can handle. And as soon as we get into something big, we're doomed anyway. So we're back to that, really. And I hope that you have around you geographically and not just through the internet some people already who are working to try to mutual aid and think in an anarchist way, because I think that's what we need primarily for our balance and our happiness, is to at least in reality have a start of this happening in our daily life, because we can talk forever online about all these wonderful ideas and all these wonderful, theories and enlightenment and community and, all these sort of things. But if it's not happening, if we don't make it happen every day, and as Torsten was saying, if we don't have a taste every day of sea, mud, rain, wind, grass, smells of nature, we're wasting our time. So it's what we do. It's what we do that's important. Really, what we do every day.
Yeah. Look, I agree. I live in a very little town. A very little shed in a very little town, and I know I've done work on most of the streets in my town, and so I know a lot of people, but the people on my street I know the best. There's only a couple of thousand people in my little town, but yeah, and in that regard, we quite often hop the fence and have drinks and light fire, and these people are wouldn't agree with me about much, to be honest. But there's always room to find common ground, and I've found it less complicated talking collapse with people who would generally be described, I suppose, as semi-literate people, than with the environmental crowd. So I don't know what that's about, but it seems to be some sort of. Kate might have some theories on this, but yeah, I find it easier talking to regular people than to people who are heavily invested in there being some kind of heroic outcome. I don't believe there will be a heroic outcome. I don't think there's any chance of there being a heroic outcome. But yeah, anyway, yeah, totally. I think people should talk collapse in their communities and see what kind of amazing and wonderful responses they get. I've had some good responses. I've had some negative ones, but yeah, it's really important to be part of your community and to talk about issues with them. So I advise everybody to do that. I'll hand on to Kate.
So I have to tread a little bit carefully here. So I work at a university and I have at times talked collapse with my colleagues. So I'm surrounded by people who have expertise in ecology, environmental management, physical geography, human geography, planning, climate change. Climate change is an overarching kind of glue that fits a lot of the people I work with together, that concern. And yeah, there's a lot of resistance. I think that's what I'll say. There's a lot of resistance and a lot of very deliberate blanking out. So it varies from person to person, but yeah, blanking and denial is a common response from people with expertise in climate change, sustainability and environment. A call for positivity. Shouldn't talk about negative stuff, shouldn't use the word collapse. Not everyone, this is not broad brush. Different people have different responses, but these are the experts, and they find it very challenging on a number of levels. Obviously, it's challenging on a personal level. There's no denying that, and we've talked about, it's a process to get into collapse acceptance, and not necessarily a very easy process. But it's also challenging to people on a professional level if they work in it, because a lot of these people are very well intentioned. They're working really hard. Some of them have spent decades working really hard to make the world a better place, to turn around the horrendous violence done against the environment and ecology and people around the planet by our current systems and processes. And it is very challenging from that point of view for people to face up to the failure of that. I was involved with those attempts. Tristan's nodding.
The question that Gary had, I'll post it when I.
Yeah, absolutely. I recognized everything you said there. And I also recently read Derek Jensen, his book, A Language Older Than Words, from 2000, I think. And in that, he actually explains that we humans, or humanity, have a much broader tendency of lying about things, lying about us being good and the beasts and the animals being bad and all that kind of thing. So it seems that it's a much older thing than just within the climate society or climate science and movement, that we are trained almost from we are kids to blank out all the bad things and in Derek's case, don't mention what dad did to your sister or to you last night, that kind of thing. And then it goes all the way into war and peace and environment and destroying insect populations, bee populations, and all of these things. When we talk about bees, by the way, do you know what Monsanto did when some science reports came out from bee scientists to explain the bee colony collapse? Monsanto actually bought up 2 of the biggest bee research institutes. They just bought them in order to come up with better reports about cause and effect. So it's a very, very untruthful and sort of a systemic lie culture that we are living in, at least in the West, I think.
But I think that as long as we don't battle the beast inside us, we won't be able to. We'll bang our heads against walls, trying to undermine and destroy the horrors that we're doing as humans. There is something in us, in our rational minds, the part that's rational, the parts that's addicted to technology, the parts that denies our connection with everything, humans, animals, nature, minerals, water, everything. This part of ourselves that we have a term for it in our group because we've been, but you need to put names on things, but we could call it the mind, we could call it the rational mind, we could call it what creates language, what creates logic. And as long as we are not trying to defeat this and control it, we often refer in our conversations to Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who has written a very good book he's written a recent one, but an older one called The Master and His Emissary, where he analyzes the brain a bit. That he takes the idea of left and right brain, but we're a bit more subtle in that. We would say that there's a certain part of the left brain that is causing most of our problems because it's gone in overdrive, and it's totally not letting the right part of our brain take the reins and control it. And it's at the core of what happened when hunter-gatherers started to get organized, to put fences, to start to destroy the soil, start to keep animals, etc. Started to think logically, started to use numbers, started to think surplus. This little part of our logic and rational thing is at the root, I think, of a lot of what we are doing now. And as long as we're not going to face that in ourselves, all of us, whether we collapse aware or not, there's absolutely no point in trying to have any conversation with people who are part of this system, if you follow what I'm saying. What do you think?
Sorry, Kate's waiting for me to respond, I think. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. So many complicated ideas. I don't know. I don't really know where to start. Yeah. I don't think I can contribute.
No worry. I was just rambling on things that I'm thinking about a lot and that we discuss a lot between us. And I just don't know if I introduced it maybe too bluntly and without enough background to explain really what I'm just jolting things out there, and we can pick that up again another time. But I think that I was listening to Kate and how she is probably dedicated and meeting people who are dedicated, who really think that they're doing something in the world. And I've met some people like that, and I really love them to bits. But what I find in myself and what I find in others is that as long as you haven't started to recognize in yourself this thing that disconnects us with nature, this lack or this suppression or this inability, you will not be able to come to terms with what other people are doing or thinking. You need to look inside. That's really it is. That's why activism is also a personal quest, as much as, and you need to know that, and you need to know yourself. You need to know it inside. Have a really, really honest look at where you are, and you can then embrace much more areas of activism. And it's a long road. I'm not saying that I'm there, but I'm not. But I'm just trying to take that into consideration.
Yeah, look, I think that's a valuable thing to do at any time in any context. So, that's always going to be useful, and potentially, particularly useful given the state of our predicament. So, yes, I'd support that. Kate.
So it reminds me of some of the conversations within the collapse community about how activism can become more sustainable in the context of collapse, because understanding collapse requires accepting collapse requires a level of integration in your life that can sometimes be missing, or has sometimes perhaps been missing in activism in a non-collapse world, where people burn out. It's not an uncommon experience that people absolutely flog themselves in an attempt to get outcomes. Often it gets really huge odds, and it can be devastating for individuals and groups, obviously. But there has been conversations in the collapse community that collapse activism kind of frees you from some of that pressure of having to flog yourself to have a particular win or achieve some kind of goal, because accepting collapse, you're living life. You're trying to live life to the fullest in whatever time frame we have left, more attentive to the day-to-day. So there's conversations that collapse activism kind of frees you up from that risk of burnout, because going outside, as everyone's been talking about, and experiencing some kind of joy or pleasure in the natural environment, and being grateful for that opportunity in the context of collapse, is a form of action. It's a form of activism. It's not necessarily the be all and end all, but it is caring for your child, which, if you've got children, you have to do. You do every day. In the context of collapse, that's a form of activism. So, yeah, I think collapse opens up the parameter for activism. It's not just getting 10,000 signatures on a petition or locking onto a piece of machinery and ending up in jail. Under particular circumstances for particular people, all those kinds of devices and tools are undoubtedly still useful, but collapse broadens that, and it becomes more of a whole of life dedication, where there's no separation between kind of the domestic, homely life and the outside work of what we'd normally associate with activism.
Yeah, I think that Kate covered that. I would just say that the small relative justices can be achieved day to day in your community, in your workplace, in your home. The heroic victory and of the Leviathan approach, I think is a not.
The question that Gary had, I'll post it when I get.
Okay.